The cold glow of a television screen flickered across the marble walls of a Soviet command center deep inside Moscow. It was early morning, the kind of hour when even generals felt the weight of silence. But tonight, there was no sleep, only stunned eyes locked on a broadcast from across the world. On CNN, grainy footage from the Iraqi desert showed something unthinkable. T-72 main battle tanks, once the pride of Soviet armored engineering, erupting into fireballs in seconds. Each frame was a gut punch. The iconic silhouette of the T-72, once feared from Europe to Asia, was barely visible before it was pierced by glowing streaks of light. U.S. M1 Abrams tanks. Operating from distances the Soviets had claimed were beyond effective combat range, fired one round after another. Each shot ended with a mushrooming explosion, turret caps blown skyward, hulls fractured open like tin cans. The announcer's voice was calm, clinical. But what he described was chaos. American forces have encountered Iraqi Republican Guard armor and destroyed dozens of Soviet-made T-72 tanks in the opening hours of the ground war. Engagement ranges exceeded 2,500 meters. U.S. tanks took no confirmed losses. In the command center, one general whispered, "That's impossible. Those tanks have composite armor. They were built to fight NATO." Another adjusted his glasses, trying to make sense of the feed. "They must be hitting ammo racks," someone muttered, "or maybe these aren't real T-72s." But they were, and the implications were catastrophic. The Soviet Union had exported thousands of T-72s across the globe. They were a cornerstone of Warsaw Pact deterrence, a symbol of strength in steel. Yet here, on global television, they were dying faster than anyone imagined possible. Not in the hands of untrained conscripts, but elite Iraqi armored divisions trained by Soviet advisors. The footage repeated. An Abrams crewman's thermal sight locked on. A second later, a shell pierced through a T-72 like it was made of paper. There was no smoke screen, no maneuver, no defense, just an explosion. And then silence. Back in Moscow, no one spoke. Because for the first time in decades, Soviet generals weren't watching a propaganda reel. They were watching their own legacy burn live. In the 1970s, the T-72 was introduced as a game changer, a rugged, low-profile main battle tank built to spearhead Soviet armored thrusts into Western Europe. It was fast for its class, relatively cheap to produce, and packed a punch with its 125mm smoothbore cannon. To Soviet strategists, it was the hammer that would break NATO's defensive lines, and its reach extended far beyond the USSR. Thousands were exported to client states across the globe: India, Syria, Poland, and most notably, Iraq. Soviet advisors trained foreign crews, praising the tank's autoloader system, its composite armor, and its ability to operate in harsh conditions. Western analysts took note. In many NATO briefings, the T-72 was marked as the primary armored threat on the European battlefield. To the world, the T-72 became more than a machine. It was a symbol of Soviet might, proof that Moscow could project hard power through steel and fire. But the tank also carried hidden flaws. Its autoloader, while innovative, stacked ammunition in a ring around the turret, perfect for quick reloads, but fatal if penetrated. The armor, once formidable, lagged behind rapidly advancing Western anti-tank rounds, and its optics and fire control systems were generations behind their American counterparts. Still, few outside the Pentagon believed the tank would perform this poorly in a real war. Soviet commanders believed its speed and firepower would dominate, and so did the Iraqis until 1991, because in the deserts of Kuwait and southern Iraq, the truth would emerge. not in training exercises or redacted reports, but in the crosshairs of M1 Abrams tanks. And that truth would shatter illusions built over decades. For decades, the Soviet Union built its armored warfare doctrine on speed, mass, and overwhelming firepower. Their strategy didn't rely on the precision of a single shot. It counted on hundreds of tanks swarming through gaps, overwhelming NATO's defenses through sheer volume. It was doctrine forged in the shadow of World War II and refined in the Cold War's arms race. Soviet military planners expected war in Europe to be brutal and fast-moving. T-72s would charge forward under cover of artillery and air support, crossing borders and flattening opposition. In this model, survivability wasn't about one tank enduring, it was about having enough replacements to keep pushing forward. And so, mass production became the priority. The T-72 was built to be easily manufactured and deployed in huge numbers. Precision fire systems, secondary, night vision limited, communication basic at best. The idea was that if one tank was lost, 10 more would roll in behind it. This doctrine wasn't just theoretical, it was exported. Iraq adopted it wholesale, with Soviet-trained officers, formations modeled on Red Army structures, and thousands of T-72s parked and ready for action. When Saddam invaded Kuwait, he did so with a force designed around Soviet armored warfare concepts, expecting that, in a straight fight, mass and momentum would prevail. But by 1991, warfare had changed. The U.S. military had spent the 1980s revolutionizing its approach to ground combat. Precision-guided munitions, thermal imaging, digital communications, all designed not just to fight Soviet tanks, but to destroy them before they could even react. Soviet commanders watching from Moscow still believed in their doctrine. They still believed that T-72s, in sufficient numbers, could stand against the best NATO had to offer. That belief was about to meet an American tank crew operating at night, and a thermal sight that saw the T-72 before it even turned its turret. Because this wasn't the war they had prepared for. This was a doctrine about to be humiliated live on CNN, January 17, 1991. Across the globe, televisions flickered to life. CNN broadcast live images of tracer fire over Baghdad, launching a new era of warfare, one where battles unfolded, not just on the ground, but in real time, across living rooms and war rooms alike. In Moscow, Soviet generals gathered to watch, curious, calm, still confident. That calm lasted seconds. On screen, American M1 Abrams tanks moved with surgical precision across the desert, engaging Iraqi armored divisions at ranges exceeding 3,000 meters, well beyond the reach of T-72 fire control systems. There were no grand tank duels, no extended exchanges, just flashes, followed by explosions. One moment, the T-72 sat ready, the next gone, fireballs, secondary detonations, turrets flung dozens of feet into the air, and each moment captured on camera, broadcast live for the world to see, to Soviet commanders. The sight was unimaginable. T-72s weren't just losing, they were vanishing before they could fire a shot. Their armor, designed to withstand shaped charges and older kinetic rounds, crumpled against depleted uranium shells fired from miles away. Thermal sights allowed Abrams crews to see at night, through smoke, dust, and deception, rendering camouflage useless and concealment pointless. The battlefield wasn't chaotic, it was clinical, and that, more than anything, shocked the Soviet command. This wasn't brute force, this was precision. This was dominance not through numbers, but through information, technology, and coordination. The very pillars of Soviet armored warfare mass, momentum, Mechanized shock were disintegrating under the weight of a single, televised truth. America didn't just outrun them in technology. They had redefined how wars would be fought and how tanks would die, and the whole world, including the architects of the T-72, watched it unfold in real time. They weren't just seeing the fall of tanks. They were witnessing the collapse of an era. The T-72, once hailed as a symbol of Soviet engineering prowess, entered Desert Storm outmatched in nearly every category that mattered. Its 125mm smoothbore cannon, while formidable on paper, lacked the advanced fire control systems necessary to engage targets effectively at long range. Against U.S. M1 Abrams tanks equipped with laser rangefinders, thermal sights, and computer-assisted targeting, it was like fighting blindfolded. Iraqi crews, many of them undertrained and operating outdated export models of the T-72, had little chance of surviving an engagement. American tank crews, by contrast, trained rigorously to fight at night, to fire on the move, and to coordinate across mechanized formations using encrypted digital radios. In essence, they were living decades ahead of the battlefield they faced. Then came the ammunition problem. T-72s stored shells in a carousel autoloader beneath the turret, efficient, but deadly. When an American round penetrated the armor, it ignited the ammo, triggering catastrophic explosions that sent the turret skyward. These jack-in-the-box kills weren't just devastating. They became symbolic of just how vulnerable the tank truly was. On the other hand, the M1 Abrams was a fortress. Its Chobham composite armor could shrug off hits that would have turned lesser tanks into molten scrap, and its gas turbine engine, despite criticisms over fuel consumption, delivered speed, agility, and battlefield superiority. Even the skies betrayed the T-72. American air superiority meant that A-10s, F-15Es, and Apache helicopters scoured the battlefield for armor targets. Some T-72s never even faced another tank. They were destroyed from above, spotted by infrared sensors and struck with laser-guided bombs and Maverick missiles. The battlefield had turned into a hunting ground, and the T-72 was prey. In the end, the T-72 didn't just lose the fight. It lost the future. As Soviet generals continued to watch the destruction unfold on CNN, a chilling realization sank in. This wasn't just about Iraq. This was about them. Their entire armored doctrine, built over decades and focused on mass assaults and numerical superiority, had been rendered obsolete in a matter of days. Every tank exploding on screen, every Iraqi battalion wiped out in minutes, was a reflection of their own force structure. The Soviet Union had thousands of T-72s in service. Many of their satellite states used them too. If the Americans could dismantle an entire tank division with such ease in the desert, what hope would their own forces have in Eastern Europe against real-time targeting, against night vision dominance, against fire-and-forget missiles in command briefings that followed? Panic set in. Questions were raised not just about the effectiveness of the T-72, but about every layer of Soviet defense. Radar vulnerability, electronic warfare gaps, and the inability to counter precision-guided munitions became urgent topics. Years of projecting power through massive parades of armor had convinced the Soviet leadership of their invincibility. But in just a few nights, that illusion shattered broadcast not by military analysts or classified reports, but by the global reach of American media. CNN had become a weapon. Its coverage didn't just inform, it demoralized. The final blow wasn't a missile or a shell. It was a truth no general wanted to face. The Soviet Union had been fighting the last war, and America had already moved on to the next one. In the halls of Soviet military academia, there was still one last theory clinging to life, a hope that the debacle wasn't about the T-72s at all. Instead, some insisted the problem lay with the Iraqis themselves. Poor tactics, inadequate training, low morale. The argument was seductive, the tank was sound. It was the crew that failed. Soviet advisors doubled down on this idea, pointing to how Iraqi units exposed their flanks, failed to disperse, and often engaged without proper reconnaissance. With better command and control, one general argued in a classified debrief, they would have absorbed the first strike and counterattacked. It was a comforting delusion, allowing the high command to preserve their pride in Soviet engineering. They ignored the fact that even well-dug tanks were precisely located and eliminated. They dismissed that American A-10s were loitering in the sky for hours, delivering kill after kill without resistance. They downplayed that Abrams crews were destroying targets from ranges the T-72's fire control system could barely detect, let alone engage. But the battlefield data refused to be ignored. Gun camera footage showed enemy tanks erupting before they could react. Thermal optics recorded the slow, blind turn of Iraqi armor in the final moments before impact. The Soviet theory that superior tactics would save them began to collapse under the weight of mounting evidence. You could train a tank crew to perfection, but it wouldn't matter if they never saw the enemy and died before they touched the trigger. The Americans had crossed a threshold not of firepower, but of perception. They could see, they could strike, and they didn't need to be seen. It wasn't the T-72 that failed. It was the entire concept of armored warfare as the Soviets understood it. Back in Moscow, the offices of the GRU were flooded with field reports that defied explanation. Fighter squadrons were being taken out before they ever saw their attacker. Radar signatures vanished. Intercept missions were aborted because targets simply disappeared. Initially, Soviet intelligence officers suspected some kind of deception or electronic warfare. Surely the Americans were using a new airborne radar platform, maybe one piggybacked on satellites or drones. But none of the usual indicators were present. Nothing lined up. The KGB, alarmed by the unexplained losses, activated sleeper agents in the West. But the reports they returned were equally baffling rumors of an aircraft that could track multiple targets beyond 100 miles, missiles that guided themselves, and systems so classified that even American pilots barely understood how they worked. Everything pointed back to one source, the AWG-9 radar system on board the F-14 Tomcat. Soviet engineers were stunned. The range, precision, and tracking capability were decades beyond anything the USSR had fielded. Reverse engineering wasn't even an option. Every technical spec was encrypted or compartmentalized within programs the Soviets couldn't penetrate. Worse, the Americans fed disinformation, simulated radar signatures, decoy frequencies, and training exercises designed to mislead Soviet surveillance, painted a picture that was always wrong. Every time the Soviets tried to model the system, it slipped through their understanding. In one internal GRU assessment, the chilling verdict read, "We are no longer watching the Americans evolve. We are chasing shadows cast by weapons we cannot detect." And just like that, the mighty Soviet intelligence machine built to predict, monitor, and counter Western advancements went blind. What the Soviets had failed to grasp was that the F-14 Tomcat was not just a fighter, it was a flying weapons platform decades ahead of its time. At the heart of its terrifying effectiveness was the AWG-9 radar, the first airborne system capable of simultaneously tracking 24 targets at over 100 miles and engaging 6 of them at once. This wasn't just an improvement, it was a paradigm shift. The AWG-9 paired perfectly with the AIM-54 Phoenix missile, a weapon with a range of over 100 miles and a guidance system that didn't require constant input from the launching aircraft. Fire and forget wasn't just a capability, it was a doctrine. Soviet pilots who had grown up on GCI ground-controlled intercept tactics were completely unprepared. They expected visual contact, or at most, short-range radar locks before engaging, but the F-14s could strike long before a MiG ever knew it was in danger. In the sky, surprise is everything, and the Tomcat turned the concept of beyond visual range into a lethal first-strike capability. Worse still, the Phoenix could hit high speed, maneuvering targets, bombers, cruise missiles, even other fighters. There was no safe zone, no altitude or evasive maneuver that guaranteed escape. To Soviet air doctrine, this broke every rule. In training exercises, Tomcat pilots practiced engaging hostile formations before they even crossed the horizon. The radar would light up the battle space like a digital map, assigning threats, prioritizing targets, and launching waves of Phoenix missiles with machine precision. For the first time, aerial dominance wasn't a contest of reflexes or pilot bravado. It was a contest of systems, and America's system was untouchable. As the full scope of America's aerial advantage became clear, morale within Soviet aviation units began to deteriorate. Veteran pilots who once bragged about dogfighting prowess suddenly found themselves questioning everything they knew about air combat. They weren't losing because of bad tactics. They were losing because they never even got to fight. In simulated engagements and intelligence reports, the F-14s consistently struck without warning and disappeared before retaliation was possible. The MiGs, which once ruled the skies over Eastern Europe and Korea, were now obsolete the moment they lifted off. One Soviet colonel described it best in a classified debrief. You feel like prey in a hunt. You're flying blind, and they're already pulling the trigger from over the horizon. The psychological toll was immense. Training flights were haunted by a sense of futility. Even elite squadrons began to question the value of their missions. What was the point of intercepting when the enemy could engage you before you even knew they were there? Younger pilots, especially those fresh from academies, were shaken. They'd been taught that victory came from aggression and awareness. But the Americans had changed the rules. Now it was about systems, sensors, and software. And the USSR was playing catch-up in a game where the goalposts kept moving. KGB briefings reported rising doubts within aviation command. Political officers were instructed to bolster morale, but even propaganda couldn't hide the truth. The Soviets had been leapfrogged, and not by a single plane, but by a doctrine, a weapon system, and a philosophy of air dominance that their own designers couldn't replicate. The shock waves from the F-14's performance didn't stop on the tarmac. They rippled through Soviet aerospace engineering, defense policy, and even military culture. The terrifying effectiveness of the Tomcat and its beyond visual range capabilities exposed deep flaws in Soviet planning. It forced a reckoning. In the years that followed, Soviet design bureaus scrambled to respond. New MiG and Sukhoi variants were developed with larger radars, more powerful engines, and even experimental long-range missiles. But no matter how fast they built or how hard they trained, one reality remained: they were chasing an American ghost. The Tomcat didn't just win dogfights, it changed the definition of air superiority. More importantly, it forced the USSR to rethink its own military doctrine. Gone were the days of massed formations and swarm attacks. The U.S. had proven that quality when paired with information dominance, could decimate quantity. And this shift didn't end with the Cold War. Even in the 21st century, echoes of the F-14's legacy persist in every stealth fighter, networked combat system, and data-linked squadron. America had demonstrated that the sky belonged not to the fastest jet or the best pilot, but to the side that saw first, shot first, and struck hardest. In contrast, the USSR would ultimately collapse before it could fully close the gap. The Cold War arms race wasn't just about bombs and missiles. It was about vision, and on that front, the Americans had flown circles around them. If this story gave you chills, if you're amazed by the sheer dominance of the F-14 and how it rewrote the rules of air combat, then hit that like button and make sure you're subscribed for more Cold War military breakdowns just like this. We're uncovering the real, lesser-known moments where technology turned the tide, and trust us, there are plenty more where this came from. Got a favorite Cold War weapon or a jaw-dropping encounter you want us to cover next? Drop it in the comments. We read every one. And if you want to see how other American platforms like the B-52, the F-117, or the A-10 shook Soviet confidence to its core, check out the rest of our series right here on the channel. Thanks for watching. Now you know why the Soviets feared a jet they couldn't even see on radar.